but he feels like the entire effort of foreign policy of the last 3 years hinges on preventing Donald Trump from returning to the White House. And so in the absence of an electoral victory for Biden, all the good things that he and his team might have achieved could be undone. That may be an incorrect way to view the world. It may be too partisan, it may be too simplistic, but I think that's a big fraction of how they look at the world. So for Biden, the ultimate, out of these 5 crises I've talked about, he needs to keep 4 of these problems quiet, and then wind down Gaza as fast as he can. And that's going to be the essence of the U.S. policy challenge in this election year when we think about bullets and ballots.
喺睇片之前，大家記得分享、讚好同訂閱灼見名家，最緊要撳埋呢個鐘仔，咁你就唔會錯過我哋嘅最新影片。
So how much has the world changed in 40 years? And I think, to me, I think for the better. A lot of Americans are scared by the change because the world was simpler in the 1980s, but I think it's actually still better today. When I did work for Congress at the Congressional Budget Office from 1989 to 1994, there were just 2 studies that I was able to work on back then that I want to mention today because I think they're just nice historical reference points. And one of them is sort of a cautionary note, and one of them is sort of a hopeful note about the U.S.-China relationship, if there's any parallel. And the cautionary note is that after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in August of 1990, we were asked at CBO to estimate what a war to liberate Kuwait might cost. So as you know, that war happened, Operation Desert Storm in early 1991. And as a young, recently minted PhD, I love this project because it was a chance to use all my analytical tools that I had learned in graduate school and apply them to a real-world problem. But all of our bosses were terrified because they're thinking there's only 2 outcomes here. 1, we're basically right and everybody forgets it. Or 2, we're dramatically wrong and everybody remembers, especially the people in Congress who pay our paychecks and write the appropriations for the Congressional Budget Office every year. And by the way, as you know, in the Iraq War 12 years later, when we invaded and overthrew Saddam, the Bush administration dramatically understated the estimated costs and thought that they might be a few tens of billions of dollars. And it turned out to be, depending on how you measure, maybe $2 trillion, just for us, just our cost, and just the dollar cost. Now, with the invasion of Kuwait and then the liberation of Kuwait, we estimated that the war might cost somewhere between $30 billion and $90 billion, and it cost about $60 billion. But that was a much more predictable mission. Heaven forbid the United States and China ever fight, because I would not know how to begin to do the calculation on how long that war would last, how it would end, what kind of suffering would be entailed along the way by both sides, and what the cost would be, not only in terms of the immediate effects, spending for the military, but also the disruption to the global economy. So I think you would probably agree with me, but I just wanted to make that observation in passing that I feel like our generation and your generation, we all need to work hard to make this war never happen. It must never happen. That's the cautionary note. And then the more hopeful note is in this same period of time that I was at the Congressional Budget Office, the Berlin Wall had just fallen down and the Cold War had ended. And well, the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, so this was all happening along the way. But we were asked by a middle-aged senator from Delaware named Joe Biden to estimate how much the United States might be able to save on its nuclear weapons programs as a result of the Cold War ending. And we came up with estimates that would be as high in today's dollars as $30 to $40 billion a year, and that was just for the nuclear forces. So there's a lot of potential to save money if we can keep this relationship positive. And I want to talk about Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and then the broader Middle East and the broader challenge of terrorism. Those are the 5 big things that have been on the minds of American strategists and defense planners over the last decade. And I think they help capture a lot of the essence of where we are today with American national security policy making in 2024. my overall thesis is as follows. Joe Biden does not have any ambitions of winning a Nobel Peace Prize this year. What he wants to do is be re-elected and manage the world in the meantime and prevent any new big crisis, mostly because Joe Biden's a good guy and he doesn't like war and he doesn't like crises, but also he needs to be re-elected to prevent Donald Trump from returning to the White House, which he considers central to his foreign policy, and I think he's right. Whether you like Trump or Biden, they are very different in some ways. Some of their policies are not as different as you might think, but in terms of decision-making style and in terms of how they see each other, they're very different. So Joe Biden has one goal, and that's to be reelected. Because if he's not reelected, what he thinks of as his considerable accomplishments in foreign and domestic policy could be largely undone by a reelected Donald Trump, who, by the way, could be very different in a second term than he was in the first term. And we can talk about that later if you like as well. So the theory of the case here is that Joe Biden wants to keep problems from getting worse. If there were a way to win a Nobel Peace Prize with some big new policy towards the Middle East, I have no doubt that President Biden would be happy to help achieve that and to share that peace prize with as many people who were involved in fashioning a stable peace for the Middle East as possible. But I think realistically, the ambitions are not that high. Realistically, we don't see that much potential for anything except mitigating the problem and trying to end the act of violence. So with Russia, the bad news is nobody really has figured out how this war will end. And personally, I believe that we'll have to encourage our Ukrainian friends to make some compromises on both territory and on their security affiliations. In other words, I'm not sure NATO is really going to be the answer. But the good news is that we now have a big aid package that's gone through our Congress, and the Europeans and Japanese are doing a lot to help Ukraine. And the Ukrainians themselves have been extraordinarily impressive. And nobody really has a clear vision of how this war ends in 2024 for a number of reasons, including that Vladimir Putin still thinks time is on his side. He thinks he can gin up Russian defense industry such that Russia will ultimately win. Or maybe Donald Trump will be reelected and pull the plug on American support. And one way or another, I think Putin is going to keep fighting this year no matter what. And therefore, it's not realistic to expect any kind of peace process even to begin. It's also not realistic to think that Ukraine can win back the territory that Russia has stolen from it this year, because Ukraine doesn't have the military capability right now to do that. If it has any chance, it'll be next year, not this year. And even then, I believe it will be difficult. So for 2024, U.S. policy towards Ukraine is just help the Ukrainians as much as we can with the ongoing fight. Essentially a continuation of policy of the last 2 years. So again, the bad news is nobody has a clear vision for how this ends. The good news for that topic for this year is Biden doesn't really have to come up with any big new ideas. Maybe he should, but I don't think he will. I think the goal is going to be to give the Ukrainians the tools they need to at least prevent a further deterioration of their current position. And they're losing a little bit of land right now as we speak, as you know. And then hopefully set the Ukrainians up for some kind of a successful military offensive next year, or at a minimum, a position of strength going into a peace process with Russia. So that's the policy on Russia. And we're going to try to tighten up a few sanctions, and we may confiscate some of the interest payments that are earned off of Russia's frozen bank assets to give to Ukraine. There'll be a few things that happen. Obviously, the people who work this problem will be paying careful attention to the tactics and the territorial movements of the forces. But for the most part, we sort of have Russia policy figured out for the year, at least as far as this administration is concerned. That's what I think. On North Korea, I believe that what the Biden administration has been doing for the entire 3 years, sort of like what the Obama administration did for 8 years, was more or less to try to ignore the problem. but also keep the US-ROK alliance strong, tighten the US-ROK Japan network, because as you know, we are allies with Japan, we are allies with South Korea, but South Korea and Japan are not allies with each other for reasons you understand very well. And we felt for a long time that we at least need to get them to be able to work together better. And that's probably been happening. That's part of why we had that conference last summer at Brookings, because what was happening is that Kurt Campbell and Rahm Emanuel were getting ready to go support their president as he met with the Prime Minister of Japan and the President of South Korea at Camp David in one of the first, if maybe the first, triangular summit of that type that we've ever had. So the policy towards the Korean Peninsula has been strengthen deterrence and let Kim Jong-un know we're willing to talk anytime, any place, once he's ready. And otherwise, if he wants to cause a lot of problems with his missile and nuclear tests, we're not going to give him more attention than he's getting. We're not going to sort of play to that approach, sort of a benign neglect. I understand the logic because, as you know, working with China, the United States and South Korea and Japan and Russia spent a lot of time in the 1990s and 2000s trying to figure out a plan to limit North Korean nuclear expansion, and we failed. We put a lot of energy into it, and it didn't work. And so Obama and Biden decided they're not going to waste their time and reward North Korea just for its provocations. So they've essentially tried to put it in a box. And as you know, that box got a lot tighter in 2017 after the North Korean nuclear and missile tests, when we then imposed much stronger UN sanctions on North Korea. But unfortunately, over the last 2 years, that box has gotten a lot looser and more fragile as China, to some extent, but especially Russia, have no longer been very interested in enforcing those sanctions because of the breakdown in broader US-Russia relations, and we all know that story. So North Korea policy is sort of in limbo, but if you ask the administration, the US administration, they'll say, well, at least we've got some sanctions, at least we've got a stronger US-ROK alliance, more cooperation from Japan, and we're also not rewarding Kim Jong-un. I'm not that supportive of this policy, by the way. I think they should be trying harder to negotiate with North Korea. And we can come back to that if you wish later on. I don't really believe benign neglect is a viable way to think about North Korea. And this is also a place where the US and China should be able to collaborate better than we are right now. And we need a few places like that, a few areas where we can do better together. But Biden's not going to touch this problem in 2024 unless Kim Jong-un makes him. So that's issue number 2, where we're sort of on autopilot. That's a little bit of an overstatement, but we largely have the approach, Biden and his team have the approach figured out that they're comfortable with. You might not like the approach, it might fail as a strategy, but they seem to sort of have it figured out in their own minds for what they want to try to do for the rest of this year.
中意名家分析，記得俾 like 同埋分享，支持同訂閱卓見名家，最緊要撳埋呢個鐘仔，咁就唔會錯過我哋嘅新片。